Section 1. The beginning of everything. There is something almost surreal about the fact that Family Guy exists at all. Not in a cynical sense, and not because it is undeserving, but because the chain of events that had to align in exactly the right order at exactly the right moment. For this particular show to come into existence, survive two cancellations, and ultimately outlast almost every other animated comedy of its era is so unlikely that if someone wrote it as a pitch document, a sensible executive would probably circle the coincidences in red and ask for revisions. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973 in Kent, Connecticut. He grew up in a small New England town with the specific, all-consuming love of animation that some people carry from childhood into adulthood without ever finding a reason to set it down. He did not watch cartoons the way most kids did, consuming them passively on Saturday mornings before going outside. He studied them. He analyzed timing. He thought about why a held expression lands differently than a quick cut. He practiced voices the way other kids practice sports. By the time he arrived at the Rhode Island School of Design to study animation, the work was almost already done. He just needed a formal environment in which to develop it into something finished. In 1995, during his senior year, he produced a thesis film called The Life of Larry. The film is, in retrospect, unmistakably the genetic material of what would become Family Guy. The central figure is Larry Cummings, a heavy-set, affable, not particularly bright middle-aged man with a wife and a son and a talking dog. The dog, named Steve, is intellectual and sardonic, and functions as the exasperated voice of reason in a household full of noise and bad decisions. Larry's son, Milt, shares design similarities with what would eventually become Chris Griffin. The wife's name is Lois, and in a sequel short called Larry and Steve that MacFarlane produced several years later, the pilot of a plane that crashes has a chin and a vocal quality that is essentially Quagmire. An airline pilot, as Quagmire would also be. The bones of the show were there before any of the people who would eventually help build it had any idea it was coming. What happened next began with a professor making a quiet decision. MacFarlane's work at RISD caught the attention of Ellen Cockrell, the head of development at Hanna-Barbera, who saw The Life of Larry at a senior screening at the school. Cockrell offered MacFarlane a development deal. He moved to Los Angeles, spent several years working on shows like Johnny Bravo, Dexter's Laboratory, and Cow and Chicken, and absorbed everything the industry could teach him about how animated comedy works at a professional level. He was learning timing and structure and the specific mechanics of how a voice shapes a character's emotional reality. He was filing information. Then, through a connection that ran through MAD-TV, the Fox sketch comedy series, MacFarlane found himself in conversation with Fox executives. The original plan was modest. Short animated inserts for Made TV, brief cartoon interstitials to air between sketches. But when Fox saw the pilot MacFarlane produced, they made a different decision. They scrapped the MAD-TV insert plan entirely and gave MacFarlane a full series order instead. He was 24 years old. He spent approximately 6 months producing the pilot, almost entirely on his own. He wrote it. He designed it. He performed 4 of the principal character voices: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He directed it. He submitted it. Fox broadcast it on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. Roughly 22 million people watched that first episode. For a brand new animated show with no existing audience and no established mythology, that was an extraordinary debut. What followed is a story most Family Guy viewers already know in broad strokes. Fox moved the show around the schedule repeatedly, competing it against major hits without giving the audience time to form reliable viewing habits. By the end of season 3 in 2002, the show was canceled. It looked finished. Then Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air reruns on their Adult Swim block for almost nothing because nobody thought the show had residual value. When those reruns premiered on April 20th, 2003, they became the highest rated programming on Adult Swim almost immediately. Viewership for the entire block rose by roughly 239%. DVD sales for the first and second seasons were enormous. Fox, which had canceled the show twice, ordered a fourth season. The show came back in 2005 to huge ratings and has continued ever since. In early 2025, it was renewed through season 27 in a deal that carries it to its 30th anniversary. None of that was inevitable. Any link in the chain could have been different. A professor could have kept the tape. A scheduling decision could have gone the other way. An airport gate could have been reached on time on a September morning when everything else went wrong. Family Guy is, in the most literal and least poetic sense, an accident that kept happening correctly. And it is packed with secrets. Layers of reference and hidden meaning and deliberate craft buried in backgrounds and newspaper headlines and the titles of whole episodes, in the colors of fighter pilot uniforms, in the names of minor characters named after writers who thought it was funny to embed themselves in their own work. Secrets in the casting choices, in the voices, in the moments where the show accidentally or deliberately pointed at something that had not happened yet. 101 of them. We are going through every single one. Slowly, thoroughly, at whatever hour this finds you, so settle in, get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and that is entirely the point. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is there. I genuinely love reading those. And if you have not already, please subscribe. It costs you nothing and it makes a real difference. Now let us begin. The show premiered in 1999. It has been running with gaps for over 25 years. In that time, it has produced more than 400 episodes, employed hundreds of writers, voice directors, animators, composers, and production staff, and generated enough cultural material that it would take many more videos than this one to fully account for everything hidden inside it. What follows is not comprehensive. It is a selection. 101 of the best, most interesting, most surprising, most revealing facts across the show's entire history, organized to give you the most complete portrait possible of what Family Guy actually is underneath the surface that most people see. Section 2. Character Origins and Voice Secrets. Facts 1 through 15. Every character in Family Guy has an origin that predates the show itself. Before Peter could be Peter, someone had to find his voice in the real world. Before Stewie could be Stewie, someone had to solve the specific challenge of what an evil infant genius sounds like when he is being both genuinely menacing and genuinely funny at the same time. Before Brian could be Brian, someone had to decide that the most emotionally honest character on the show would sound exactly like the person who created him. These are the stories behind those decisions, and most of them are stranger than the show ever let on. Fact 1. Peter Griffin's voice was directly inspired by a real human being. While Seth MacFarlane was studying at the Rhode Island School of Design in the mid-1990s, he encountered a security guard on campus with a particular kind of presence. The man was loud, blunt, very New England in his speech rhythms, with the specific cadence of someone who says whatever crosses his mind without a filtering step between thought and speech. MacFarlane started imitating the voice privately, the way you do when someone else's manner of speaking strikes you as funny, and eventually began shaping it toward a character. He rounded out the edges, added a certain cheerful denseness, built an emotional register on top of that foundation. The security guard doing his rounds at an art school almost certainly has no idea that his voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in American television history. Fact 2. Brian Griffin's voice requires no performance at all. In a 2010 interview at the Paley Center, moderated by Bill Maher, this was pointed out directly. McFarlane confirmed that Brian's voice is just the way he sounds when he speaks naturally, without any character adjustment. When McFarlane talks as himself, he sounds like Brian. The implications of this run throughout every aspect of how the character is written. Brian's political views, his atheism, his liberalism, his sense of himself as an intellectual, his complicated relationship with creative ambition, all of it maps closely to McFarlane's publicly stated positions. His fondness for whiskey and his specific pattern of social disappointment also suggest an autobiographical thread. Brian is Seth MacFarlane wearing dog ears, and MacFarlane has never really denied it. Fact 3. Stewie Griffin's voice has a specific, documented origin that involves a Hollywood legend and a very particular moment of reading. MacFarlane has told this story across multiple interviews, including an appearance on The Graham Norton Show in 2014. He was in college deeply interested in musical theater and classic Hollywood, reading a biography of Alan J. Lerner, the lyricist who wrote My Fair Lady, and came across an anecdote about Rex Harrison making a remark in a very specific tone while walking through Hyde Park during development of the show. MacFarlane heard the voice. He started doing it. He took Harrison's clipped, snobbish precision and pushed it further. Snootier, angrier, more willing to threaten violence from a position of formal rhetoric. That voice became Stewie. MacFarlane has said he considers Harrison's Professor Higgins one of the great character performances in Hollywood history, and that the voice was an act of tribute before it was anything else. Fact 4. There is a second influence on Stewie's voice that MacFarlane has mentioned in other contexts. The lower registers of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. The performative villainous quality of that character's delivery contributed to the darker undertones of Stewie's voice. Burns and Stewie share a delight in the sound of their own menace, a pleasure in being the cleverest and most dangerous thing in any room. That connects them across networks and decades. Stewie is, in a precise sense, a synthesis. Rex Harrison's precision at the top and Mr. Burns's darkness underneath, delivered by a baby in a yellow shirt sitting in a high chair. Fact 5. The show acknowledged Stewie's Rex Harrison origin in a Season 3 episode called One If by Clam, Two If by Sea. In the episode, Stewie teaches a young British girl named Eliza Pinchley to speak properly. Eliza speaks in a broad Cockney accent. Stewie is appalled and undertakes a formal elocution project. This is almost exactly the plot of My Fair Lady, in which Professor Higgins teaches a Cockney flower girl named Eliza Doolittle to speak like an aristocrat. The show is staging, in episode form, the story that inspired its most original character's voice. The double layer of reference, a character based on Rex Harrison reenacting the story Rex Harrison is most famous for, required knowing both the show's production history and the film itself to fully appreciate. Fact 6. Chris Griffin's voice was the result of a dare. Seth Green, who came in to audition for the role, was encouraged beforehand by a friend to go in and do his best impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer from Jonathan Demme's 1991 film, The Silence of the Lambs. Green did the impression at the audition, not as a throwaway gesture, but as a genuine attempt at a character. The casting directors heard it and hired him on that basis. Chris Griffin, the gentle, soft, generally confused middle child of the Griffin family, speaks with a voice pattern modeled on one of cinema's most disturbing screen villains. The show later acknowledged this directly in Season 7, when Chris reenacts Buffalo Bill's infamous bedroom scene. The moment is stranger and funnier once you know the voice was built on that character to begin with. Fact 7. Meg was originally voiced by Lacey Chabert, then well known for her role in the family drama Party of Five. Chabert voiced Meg through the first season before leaving the role. From Season 2 onward, Meg has been voiced by Mila Kunis, who was 16 years old when she auditioned. The story of how she secured the role has been confirmed in various accounts over the years. When asked her age during the audition, Kunis told the room that she was going to be 18. This was technically true. She simply did not specify that the birthday in question was approximately 2 years away. The casting team hired her. She has been a Meg Griffin ever since, across more than 2 decades and several hundred episodes. Fact 8. When Meg sings in the show, it is not Mila Kunis you are hearing. The singing voice for Meg has been provided throughout the show's run by Tara Strong, a veteran voice actress whose career spans an enormous range of animated characters across decades of television. Kunis handles the speaking voice. Strong handles the singing. The handoff is seamless enough that even long-term viewers of the show are genuinely surprised when they learn about it, because the two voices blend well enough across the character that the difference does not register consciously. Fact 9. Cleveland Brown was created and originally voiced by Mike Henry, who met Seth MacFarlane while they were both students at RISD. Henry based Cleveland's voice on a real person he encountered while playing recreational basketball. A man who mispronounced Maryland as Merlin, stretched certain vowels in a particular way, and had a measured, gentle speaking manner that struck Henry as both distinctive and funny. He started imitating it privately, then shaped it toward a character. In 2020, Henry announced he was stepping down from the role, stating that a white actor voicing a black character was no longer the right choice. Arif Zahir took over the role from season 19 onward. Fact 10. Glenn Quagmire's voice is modeled on old-time radio announcers from the 1940s. MacFarlane has described channeling the rapid-fire confidence of broadcast radio personalities from that era, men whose authority and assurance came from the medium itself rather than from anything they had actually earned. The result is a character who sounds like he belongs in a different decade, which gives Quagmire a period quality that sits amusingly against his thoroughly modern suburban context. He sounds like someone who walked out of a 1940s variety show and wandered into a bar in Rhode Island. And he has never noticed the gap. Fact 11. Seth MacFarlane voices more than 40 distinct characters across Family Guy's run. The four primary characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, are the most prominent, but the list extends throughout the show's world. Tom Tucker, the vain local news anchor, is MacFarlane. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family physician whose medical competence is consistently catastrophic, is MacFarlane. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's contemptuous billionaire father, is MacFarlane. God, who appears as a character in several episodes, is MacFarlane. At various points in any given episode, MacFarlane is having long conversations with himself. Fact 12. Alex Borstein, the voice of Lois, also voices Lois's mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt, and the newscaster Trisha Takanawa. Her connection to the show runs through MAD-TV, the Fox sketch comedy series where she was a cast member in the period when MacFarlane was first making his connections with the network. She has described encountering the show's concept as recognizing immediately that it had a specific energy, something that felt distinct from the other animated comedies being produced at the time. Fact 13. Stewie's British accent was revealed in season 16 to be entirely constructed. The episode Send in Stewie, Please Send Stewie to a School Counselor, and in a rare moment of genuine vulnerability, he drops the accent completely. Without it, he sounds like a slightly less confused version of Peter. He explains to the counselor that the accent is what he calls a coat of armor, an affectation built to make him feel special and distinct in a household where everything else is chaos and noise. He sounds like everyone else in his family without it. When the counselor says that dropping the accent means he will be just like everyone else, Stewie immediately picks it back up. The moment is one of the quieter, sadder things the show has produced, dressed up as a comic revelation. Fact 14. William H. Macy auditioned for the role of Brian Griffin in 1997. McFarlane confirmed this via social media, describing Macy's audition as good and expressing the belief that he had made a bad call in not casting him. Macy had prior voice acting experience from the animated series The Lionhearts. Imagining a version of Brian with Macy's voice, more openly sad perhaps, with a different texture to the self-destruction, requires essentially reimagining every scene the character has ever appeared in. The Brian who exists on screen is inseparable from McFarlane's own voice and sensibility. Fact 15. Seth MacFarlane's production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, is named after a piece of dorm room decoration. The door to his room at RISD was covered in fuzzy leopard print material, which he found funny. He found it funny enough, apparently, that he carried the reference forward across his entire career. Fuzzy Door Productions now appears in the credits of every episode of Family Guy, American Dad, The Cleveland Show, The Orville, and the Ted films. A bit of dorm room decor at an art school in Providence, Rhode Island has been acknowledged in the opening titles of hundreds of hours of television. Section 3. Freeze frame secrets and visual Easter eggs. Facts 16 through 30. Family Guy's writers have always operated on the understanding that a joke almost nobody will see is still worth putting there. If even a fraction of the audience pauses the episode, looks closely at the background, and laughs at what they find, that is sufficient justification for the effort of hiding it. These are the rewards for the patient ones. Fact 16. In the Season 2 episode Love Thy Trophy, Stewie is shown playing on the living room floor with his alphabet blocks. If you pause the episode and look at the arrangement of the blocks, they spell Redrum. This is the word from The Shining, both Stephen King's novel and Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation, that the psychic child Danny writes as a warning, a backward spelling of murder. The choice to assign this detail specifically to Stewie is precise beyond the obvious. In that period of the show's run, Stewie's primary narrative function was plotting to kill his mother. Redrum, in his small hands in his living room, is not just a film reference. It is an accurate description of his current project. Fact 17. In the episode Model Misbehavior, the Griffin family's photograph appears in a newspaper. Most viewers see the photo and move on. Just below the photograph in smaller print is a secondary headline that reads, DVDs paused for headline joke. Millions disappointed. The joke is structurally elegant. To read the headline, you have to pause the DVD. By pausing the DVD to find the hidden joke, you have become the subject of it. The loop is complete. The disappointment is real and also fake simultaneously. Fact 18. In Brian Does Hollywood, a fictional adult film awards ceremony nominates 3 people for Best Original Score in an adult film. 2 of the nominees are Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, both of whom are real composers who worked extensively on Family Guy's music. The 3rd nominee is John Williams, the same John Williams who scored Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Jaws, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, E.T., and Harry Potter. The show placed the most celebrated film composer of the 20th century on a fake pornographic film nomination ballot and delivered the information with complete casualness. Fact 19. The Wilhelm Scream. The specific stock sound effect originally recorded in 1951 for the Western film Distant Drums, and subsequently embedded in hundreds of Hollywood productions as a kind of professional hidden handshake, appears multiple times across different Family Guy episodes. Its presence is the sound department doing what the animators do with visual gags, dropping in something that most people will not consciously identify, but that rewards the small number of viewers who know its history. Fact 20. In the Mos Eisley Cantina scene in Blue Harvest, the background contains 4 separate crossover cameos from different animated universes. Roger from American Dad is sitting at a table. Coach McGurk from the Cartoon Network series Home Movies is present. Bender from Futurama is there. The evil monkey, who exists within Family Guy's own world, is also in the bar. This is a single scene that contains characters from 3 separate shows, plus an internal recurring character from the same show, all tucked into the background of a Star Wars parody that already has multiple foreground jokes running simultaneously. Fact 21. In the Blue Harvest Cantina scene, the TIE fighter pilots visible in the background are wearing uniforms in the colors of the Thai national flag. This is a visual pun on TIE fighter and TIE fighter. To catch it requires reading the color scheme on the uniforms of background characters in a scene where many other things are happening. The show also embedded a piece of Star Wars Expanded Universe trivia in the same scene. TIE stands for Twin Ion Engine, a technical designation that was never explained in the films themselves, but existed in the broader Star Wars literature. Fact 22. In a background television visible during a Season 7 episode, a documentary is playing about fire trucks. If you listen during quieter foreground moments, the documentary is narrating the fire truck as a predatory animal in a nature documentary format, discussing its stalking behavior, its patience, the moment it closes in on its prey. No character in the scene references this. Nobody looks at the television. It exists entirely for the viewer paying a separate level of attention to the background sound design. Fact 23. In the episode North by North Quahog, Jesus Christ appears briefly as a character driving a vehicle. His license plate reads WWID, which is one letter different from the WWJD. What would Jesus do? Bumper sticker and wristband culture of the late 1990s. His plate reads, What would I do? The joke exists in a background prop on a passing vehicle during a scene where many other things are happening. It is a perfectly placed single-letter substitution that passes in under 2 seconds. Fact 24. Brian's bookshelves, visible in various background shots across multiple seasons, contain real and carefully selected book titles. In the early seasons, when Brian was a genuinely intellectual character with actual depth, the titles reflect the reading of someone who is engaged seriously with literature. As Brian's character evolved across later seasons into something more performative and less genuine, some viewers have noted changes in the shelf composition. More prominently displayed books, perhaps more concerned with appearance than content. The bookshelves are a small ongoing portrait of where Brian is at in any given stage of the show. Fact 25. The Tron sequence in Season 3's One If by Clam, Two If by Sea contains text written into the arena wall patterns during the light cycle scene. The text reads, If you can read this, your TV is upside down. The text is printed upside down, which means you would need to rotate either the screen or yourself to read it correctly. Almost nobody has done this in the moment of watching the episode. The message exists as a communication between the production and whoever is patient enough and sufficiently unhinged to find it. Fact 26. The episode Petergeist, the show's parody of the 1982 Poltergeist film, contains visual compositions and shot framings that specifically mirror individual frames from the original. The animators and writers working on the episode clearly had the source material in close reference, and they built cinematic homage into the structure of the scenes rather than simply adapting the plot. This is a different and more demanding kind of tribute. Not just using the same story, but paying attention to how the original story was told visually. Fact 27. The opening title sequence of Family Guy has been altered numerous times across the show's run. The variations include changes to which characters appear, what they are wearing, what they are doing in the background of the sequence, and how the show's title is presented. Unlike The Simpsons, which has made its couch gag variations into a celebrated institution, Family Guy's opening sequence variations tend to receive less formal commentary. They are there for the viewers who watch closely enough to notice what changed. Fact 28. In Family Guy Viewer, male number 1, when the show's segment gives the Griffins superpowers, Mayor Adam West mentions having dealt with super beings before. This is a reference to West's actual career playing Batman in the 1960s ABC television series. West voiced a fictionalized, deeply eccentric version of himself across many Family Guy appearances, And the show found ways repeatedly to let the character's fictional history echo his real career without making it the primary subject of any given joke. The Batman reference is a piece of background character acknowledgement that passes in a single line. Fact 29. In the season 3 episode that parodies My Fair Lady with Stewie as the teacher and Eliza Pinchley as the Cockney student, the show is doing something that operates on two simultaneous layers of reference. On the surface, it is a parody of the musical's plot. Underneath, it is a reference to the fact that Stewie's voice is based on Rex Harrison's performance as Professor Higgins in that same musical. The episode stages a scene in which a character who sounds like Rex Harrison reenacts the story Rex Harrison is most famous for. The joke requires knowing both the show's production history and the film's history to fully appreciate. Fact 30. In Back to the Pilot, where Brian and Stewie time travel to observe the events of the show's first episode, a background moment visible during one of the original cutaway sequences shows the Griffin family simply standing in the living room, doing nothing while the gag plays out. The characters have nothing to do during a cutaway. From their perspective, it is a pause in existence while an unrelated sequence plays out around them. The show illustrated, through the device of time travel and a background visual, a structural critique that critics had been making about its format for years. The critique is there, in the background, visible for the viewers who are looking for it. Section 3B. More visual gags and production details. Beyond the 30 visual Easter eggs already covered, the show contains additional layers of visual comedy and production craft worth examining. On the subject of the show's recurring musical moments, the opening theme, I Need a Jew, the multi-part musicals, the song and dance numbers that appear periodically across different seasons. All of these are produced with a level of musical craftsmanship that exceeds what most animated comedies attempt. McFarlane has a genuine musical background and legitimate vocal training, and the show's musical sequences reflect that. The harmonies in the opening theme are real harmonies. The orchestrations in the set-piece musical numbers are real orchestrations. The production treats its musical content with the same seriousness that a Broadway production would, even when the subject matter of the music is deliberately absurd. On the subject of the show's visual continuity between the Griffin house's interior and exterior shots, there is a long-standing fan observation that the house is seen from outside and the house is depicted from inside are difficult to reconcile architecturally. The exterior shows a specific configuration of windows and doors and overall size. The interior, particularly in episodes that explore rooms not regularly depicted, suggests a structure that could not fit inside the exterior as shown. The show has never addressed this directly except in the You Can't Handle the Booth episode where Peter claims the real house is in Burbank. The Burbank house, presumably, has better spatial logic. On the subject of the background art in the Griffin living room specifically, the couch, the television, the framed photographs on the walls, there is a detail that devoted viewers have noticed across many seasons. The family photographs on the wall occasionally include images from episodes that have not yet aired. At the time the episode containing the photograph is broadcast, the photos are drawn to reflect a specific version of the family at a specific time, and occasionally that time is slightly in the episode's own future. Whether this represents genuine behind-the-scenes knowledge of upcoming episode content, or simply animated background art being produced slightly ahead of the content it is depicting is genuinely unclear. On the subject of the show's title cards and episode title sequences, which occasionally contain visual jokes or references that are separate from the episode's main content, the production has used the title card as a small secondary canvas for additional material. Not every episode does this, but enough do that attentive viewers scanning the title card frame by frame will occasionally find something extra there, divorced from whatever the episode itself is about. On the subject of the show's color palette and how it has evolved across seasons, animation historians and dedicated fans have noted that the show uses slightly different greens, slightly different flesh tones, and slightly different levels of saturation in different production periods. The earliest seasons have a quality of color that is slightly more muted and textured, reflecting both the animation style of the studios working on those seasons and the different digital pipeline available at the time. The post revival seasons have a cleaner, more saturated color palette that is technically cleaner but subjectively flatter. This is a subtle distinction, but it contributes to the feeling that the show from before the cancellation looks and feels different from the show that came back, even setting aside the writing and character choices. Section 4: Writers, Names, and the Room Behind the Show Facts. 31 through 45. Family Guy has always been a show made by people who leave evidence of themselves inside the thing they are building. Once you start learning which characters and locations and throwaway details correspond to real people and real choices, the show reveals itself as a long-running inside joke with a fictional address and an animated face. Fact 31. The fictional Neil Goldman, the nerdy, acne-covered, perpetually rejected Meg-obsessed student of James Woods Regional High School, was named after a real Family Guy writer. The real Neil Goldman worked on the show during its original run with his writing partner Garrett Donovan, and the two of them contributed several early episodes, including Day Boom, Mind Over Murder, Running Mates, and E Peterbus Unum. Goldman did not choose to put himself into the show. His colleagues did it for him. The fictional Goldman is the least socially successful person in his school environment. The real Goldman went on to write for Scrubs and Community, and has by most accounts had a distinguished career. He has had the last laugh. The fictional version of him is still trying to get Meg to go to prom. Fact 32. James Woods Regional High School was named after the actual actor James Woods. In his early appearances on the show, a fictional version of Woods was depicted as so enthusiastic about attention and celebrity contact that he could be lured and trapped with a simple trail of candy. He voiced himself with apparent delight and genuine comedic instinct. The school being named after him was an act of affection from a show that rarely does affection without also doing something else. Woods' real-world relationship with the production became more complicated over time, and the fictional version of him grew less warmly drawn in later seasons. Fact 33. Chris Griffin's full legal name is Chris Cross Griffin. Peter Griffin, raised as a devout Catholic, chose the middle name Cross as a religious tribute of the crucifixion. Chris Cross Griffin. The show places this information in an episode without fanfare, and the majority of viewers hear it and process it as background character detail before moving on. The viewers who do not immediately move on realize that Peter named his son after a 1990s hip-hop duo whose biggest hit instructed listeners to jump, jump. He achieved this through sincere religious devotion. The joke requires nothing beyond the name itself. Fact 34. Meg Griffin's full first name, as revealed on a birth certificate visible in the episode A Fistful of Meg, is Megatron. Megatron Griffin. The birth certificate is on screen long enough to be read if the episode is paused. Megatron is the primary villain of the Transformers franchise. No explanation is ever provided within the show's narrative for why Lois chose this name. Nobody has ever asked. It sits in Meg's background as a piece of biographical information too strange to use and too strange to forget. Fact 35. The name Quahog, the fictional Rhode Island town where the show is set, refers to a hard-shell clam native to the Atlantic coast. Rhode Island has a significant cultural connection to quahogs. They appear in local cuisine, in state identity, in coastal Rhode Island life generally. Seth MacFarlane met Mike Henry, who would become the voice of Cleveland Brown and a key part of the writing staff, at the Rhode Island School of Design. Henry's connection to the state grounded the show's setting there. The show named its entire fictional world after a clam. Fact 36. The Griffin house at 31 Spooner Street was not on any official maps of the fictional town for the show's first several seasons. This turned from a production oversight into a plot point. In E Peterbus Unum, Peter discovers that a historical surveying error means his house technically falls outside the jurisdiction of any established municipality or nation. He uses this to declare independence and founds a country named Pretoria. He demands a pool from the United Nations. The show took a cartographic inconsistency and turned it into a story about national sovereignty. Fact 37. The episode E Peterbus Unum engages with a real legal principle. The premise that an administrative surveying gap could leave a property technically outside any recognized government's jurisdiction is not invented. There are documented historical cases of small parcels of land falling through administrative cracks in municipal and national boundaries. The show applied a genuine legal phenomenon to a suburban house and then had the house's owner demand a swimming pool from the international community. Fact 38. The Drunken Clam's internal layout is physically inconsistent from episode to episode. The bar, the booths, the pool table, the windows, and the walls do not match across scenes set in the same space. The show treats physical interiors as flexible comedic environments rather than fixed architectural realities. Fans who have tried to produce consistent floor plans of the bar based on multiple episodes find that no single layout satisfies all the available visual evidence. The Drunken Clam exists differently depending on what joke needs to happen inside it. Fact 39. Seth MacFarlane's sister, Rachel MacFarlane, has appeared in Family Guy as a voice actress across multiple episodes. She is credited for minor speaking roles and background characters in various seasons. The show has always been, in small ways, a literal family production. Fact 40. The production offices of Family Guy are decorated with physical props from past episodes. The Pretoria flag, Stewie's ray gun design, the What Really Grinds My Gears promotional poster, the Banana Brian costume, a portrait of Stewie from the episode Lois Kills Stewie, the Die Lois needlework from Season 6, a Peter versus Giant Chicken fight poster, Meg's birth certificate showing her legal name as Megatron. The people who make the show work in rooms haunted by the objects their characters have inhabited. Fact 41. The episode Pia TV, where Peter starts an unregulated cable channel, and the FCC responds by censoring real life itself, was produced as a direct response to the Federal Communications Commission's increased broadcast decency enforcement following the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show. The episode aired in November 2005. Several months later, the actual FCC sent a letter to the production. By multiple accounts from people who were present, the letter expressed that those at the commission found the episode genuinely funny. The agency, being satirized by a cartoon, liked the satire. This is one of those facts that should not have happened, but apparently did. Fact 42. The show's animation quality changed at several documented points across its run, each change corresponding to a different animation studio handling production. Rough Draft Studios, which worked on seasons 2 and 3, gave the show a looser, more physically expressive quality that longtime fans consistently prefer. The studios that handled subsequent seasons were technically more polished in some respects, but produced work that felt stiffer and less alive. Fans who have watched the show carefully across its full run can identify which studio handled which episode by subtle differences in line weight, movement style, and character expressiveness. Fact 43. The evil monkey in Chris's closet, the background horror comedy figure who pointed menacingly at Chris whenever the closet was opened, was eventually given a full emotional backstory. The monkey had moved into the closet during a period of personal devastation, having caught his wife being unfaithful. The menacing gesture was grief. It was a creature without the vocabulary to express its pain in any other way, standing in the shadows of a child's closet and pointing. The show delivered this information with complete sincerity and then moved on as if it had always been true. Fact 44. The show's fictional high school and the naming of its nerd character after a real writer represent a broader pattern of the production, embedding its own staff into the show's world. Various writers' names, personality traits, and biographical details appear as minor characters, location names, or throwaway references across the show's history. The fictional world of Quahog is, in small ways, populated by the real people who built it. Fact 45. Ernie the Giant Chicken was not planned as a recurring character. The Season 2 origin story, a fight between Peter and a chicken who gave him an expired coupon, was intended as a single, extended, deliberately over-the-top gag. The audience responded so strongly that the character was brought back, then brought back again, and eventually given a name, a wife, a home life, and a mythology. Ernie the Giant Chicken grew from a throwaway visual joke into a recurring set piece that the show staged as increasingly elaborate cinematic action. He is now one of the show's most beloved recurring presences. Section 5. Production, lore behind the scenes facts, and the story that still defies belief. Facts 46 through 60. Some of these are facts that make you put whatever you are doing down for a moment. Some require no commentary at all. Fact 46. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11. He missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes. The plane was one of the two that were hijacked that morning and flown into the World Trade Center, killing everyone aboard. MacFarlane had been drinking heavily the night before, overslept, and received an incorrect departure time from his travel agent. He was still hungover when he arrived at the airport and found the gate already closed. MacFarlane has addressed this publicly across many years. He has said that he believes fate determines these things, and that if it had been his time, he would have accepted it. He was 27 years old. Family Guy had already been canceled once. It would be canceled again before it returned for good. Fact 47. The main cast of Family Guy earns between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode. This figure has been reported by multiple entertainment publications and has not been publicly disputed. Across the full run of a show with more than 400 episodes across more than 25 seasons, the cumulative earnings from this single production alone represent numbers that become genuinely difficult to hold in the mind clearly. Fact 48. During the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, Fox broadcast 3 completed Family Guy episodes without MacFarlane's permission. The episodes had been finished before the strike began, giving Fox the legal right to air them. MacFarlane was actively on the picket line at the time. He was reportedly furious. When the strike ended on February 12, 2008, and production resumed with the episode Back to the Woods, a joke was written into the script that MacFarlane has described as a very direct middle finger, aimed at whoever authorized the decision to air without his consent. He has said the anger behind the joke was real and that he does not discount it. Fact 49. In 2009, Family Guy received a Primetime Emmy Award nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series. This was the first time an animated series had been nominated in that category since The Flintstones in 1961. Nearly 5 decades had passed between those two nominations. The Simpsons, which most critics consider the greatest animated comedy in television history, did not receive that nomination. Family Guy did. The nomination places the show in a category so historically unusual that it functions almost as a data point that looks wrong until you verify it. Fact 50. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. At that moment in its history, the show occupied a place in critical conversation that would have been difficult to predict from its early scheduling difficulties and difficult to sustain in the years that followed. But the ranking is real. The show that would eventually be moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights was, in 2013, being discussed as one of the defining achievements in the history of animated television. Fact 51. Ron Jeremy appeared in Brian Doe's Hollywood to present a fictional award. The nominees for Best Original Score in an Adult Film included Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, two real Family Guy composers who contributed extensively to the show's music, and John Williams. Jones and Murphy presumably agreed to have their names listed as potential scorers of fictional pornographic films. Williams was presumably not consulted about the use of his name in this context. Fact 52. The Cleveland in a bathtub gag originated in the season 4 episode Petergeist. Peter, having somehow acquired a tank in pursuit of building a cinema, drove the tank through Cleveland's house. Cleveland was bathing upstairs. His bathtub slid off the second floor in slow motion, while Cleveland made a specific, startled vocalization. The visual and its components became one of the show's most beloved recurring images, appearing in multiple subsequent Family Guy episodes, in the Cleveland Show spin-off, and in various tribute forms across over a decade of production. It originated because Peter built something impractical using heavy military equipment. Fact 53. Bonnie Swanson was visibly pregnant from her earliest appearances in the show, and remained in that state across approximately 7 in-universe years before eventually giving birth. The show would occasionally reference the duration. When the birth finally occurred, it was treated as a meaningful story event. The pregnancy is one of the show's most quietly sustained slow-build jokes, a background detail that accumulated across seasons into a minor narrative point. Fact 54. Table reads for Family Guy regularly include people from outside the production. Executive producer Richard Appel has described the purpose: to provide calibration from fresh ears, people who have not spent weeks living with scripts and jokes, to help the writers judge whether material that is funny to its creators is actually funny to someone encountering it for the first time. The comedy engine of the show is, at its most functional, being calibrated against outside response at every stage before animation begins. Fact 55. Seth MacFarlane was 25 when Family Guy first aired, making him the youngest showrunner of a primetime animated series in television history at that time. The responsibility of running that production, managing a writing staff, directing animation, performing multiple principal voice roles, and managing network relationships, at that age is considerable. MacFarlane has described the period as overwhelming at moments and creatively alive in a way that is difficult to replicate later. Fact 56. The pilot episode's entire budget was $50,000, provided by Fox for the initial 15-minute short. MacFarlane spent approximately 6 months producing it largely on his own. The result was seen by 22 million people on the night it aired. The ratio between the budget and the audience size is one that almost no other piece of entertainment in the history of the medium can match. Fact 57. In the season 17 episode You Can't Handle the Booth, structured as a DVD commentary track for a previous episode, Peter claims that the Griffin House is based on a real house in Burbank, California, and mentions that fans keep stealing the mailbox from the address they believe is real. The show used the commentary format to blur the line between the fictional world and the production in a way that no regular episode format allows. Characters acknowledging themselves as characters, recorded in a booth, assembled by animators, broadcast by a network, and discussing this as though it were simply another piece of the same ongoing story. Fact 58. The Griffin House at 31 Spooner Street has had an internal layout that changes between episodes for the show's entire run. The relative positions of rooms, the placement of the staircase, the location of the kitchen, none of it is physically consistent. The show has always treated physical space as a comedic tool rather than an architectural reality. Anyone who has tried to construct a consistent floor plan of the house based on multiple episode appearances will find that no single version satisfies all the available evidence. Fact 59. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, also voices Neil Goldman, the school nerd named after a real writer. The show acknowledged this within its own continuity in at least one scene where the two characters share space and someone notes their vocal similarity. It is one of the show's odder pieces of self reference, requiring awareness of the casting reality to appreciate fully. Fact 60. The Season 8 episode. Brian and Stewie, which has no cutaway gags and consists entirely of two characters talking in a bank vault overnight, was the show demonstrating something about its own potential. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because there have been moments when he has considered ending his life. Stewie expresses how much Brian means to him without jokes or deflection. The episode was praised by critics who had largely stopped praising the show, and it demonstrated that the voice cast and the two strongest characters could sustain 22 minutes of genuine emotional honesty without a single cutaway. The format the show was famous for was not in the room that night, and the episode was better for it. Section 5. B. More production facts and deeper character lore. Additional facts. Before we move into the predictions section, there are several more production stories and character details worth sitting with, because the history of this show is so dense with interesting material that covering it in broad strokes does not do it justice. On the subject of the show's casting, there is a detail about Patrick Warburton and Joe Swanson that goes beyond the basic fact of who voices him and gets into the specific philosophy behind the performance. Warburton has described in interviews that he plays Joe with complete, unwavering sincerity. There is no winking at the audience. There is no acknowledgement from inside the performance that any of what happens to Joe is absurd. When Joe talks about his determination, his physical capability, his professional pride, Warburton delivers all of it as though it is the most natural and reasonable expression of a person's inner life. The comedy does not come from Warburton playing Joe as though he is funny. It comes from the gap between how Joe sounds and how the show treats him. Warburton sounds like he could lift a car. The show keeps putting him in situations where every aspect of his dignity is stripped away in slow motion. The funnier Warburton plays it straight, the wider the gap becomes, and the wider the gap becomes, the funnier Joe gets. It is one of the cleaner illustrations in the show's history of how voice performance shapes comedy in animated television. On the subject of Mila Kunis as Meg, there is a detail about the transition between Lacey Chabert and Kunis that affects how you hear Meg's character in the show's earliest episodes. Chabert voiced Meg in Season 1 with a somewhat different register. Slightly more conventionally teenage, slightly less of the specific flatness that Kunis brings to the role in later seasons. The flatness in Kunis's performance is actually a significant part of what makes Meg work as a comic figure. There is a particular kind of humor available in a character who delivers her lines as though she has already accepted that nobody is listening, and Kunis found that register early and maintained it across decades of episodes. Chabert's Meg sounds more openly hurt. Kunis's Meg sounds like she stopped expecting anything different. On the subject of Brian's failed novelist identity, the backstory is woven throughout the show's history in ways that reward attention to continuity. Brian has been working on a novel called Faster Than the Speed of Love across many seasons. The novel is periodically referenced, occasionally completed in episodes where it is then rejected or otherwise unsuccessful, and occasionally revised. In the Season 9 episode Brian writes a bestseller, Brian abandons the serious novel entirely and writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The book becomes a massive commercial success. Brian then becomes insufferably arrogant, treats Stewie, who encouraged him to write, with contempt, and allows his success to reveal every worst quality in his personality simultaneously. The episode is widely cited as the moment Brian became definitively unlikable to a significant portion of the audience. And it works because it follows the logic of his character perfectly. The one time he succeeds, he becomes worse than he ever was when he was failing. On the subject of Stewie's time machine, it is worth noting how many of the show's most emotionally significant episodes depend entirely on the existence of this device. The time machine is arguably the most important prop in the show's history. It enables Back to the Pilot. It enables the resolution of Brian's death in Christmas Guy. It enables multiple road to episodes. It has been used to send Brian and Stewie to ancient Rome, to the future, to the first episode of Family Guy, and to hundreds of other times and places. The time machine, which was introduced as part of Stewie's evil genius identity in the early seasons, outlasted that identity entirely. The evil genius retired. The time machine kept working. It became the engine for the show's most ambitious storytelling, even as the character who built it was evolving away from the identity that justified his having built it. On the subject of Quagmire's infamous speech about Brian in the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, the speech is worth examining not just as comedy, but as a piece of writing. The speech is delivered by a character whose own moral standing is, to put it charitably, complicated. Quagmire is a serial womanizer with a track record of behavior that the show has depicted with varying degrees of criticism across different seasons. He is not a reliable moral authority. And yet every specific accusation in the speech is backed by depicted events. Quagmire calls Brian out for being a pretentious fraud. He calls him out for constantly pursuing Lois in front of Peter. He calls him out for his abandoned son. He calls him out for pretending to be an intellectual without having done the intellectual work. Every item on the list is documentable. The show chose to have its most morally compromised recurring character be the one to deliver the most accurate assessment of its most self-styled moral character. The irony is either accidental or the most deliberate piece of characterization in the show's history. On the subject of the giant chicken, whose name, to state it clearly once more, is Ernie, the evolution of his role in the show is a study in how a single successful gag can accrete mythology. The first fight was in the season 2 episode Daboom. The chicken gave Peter a coupon. The coupon had expired. Peter was furious about the expired coupon. A fight broke out. The fight kept going. It went through buildings, through traffic, through a commercial kitchen, through a shopping mall, and did not end so much as pause, with both combatants too exhausted to continue. The sequence lasted longer than most cutaway gags ran in total. It was the most extended single joke the show had attempted, and it worked because the escalation was relentless and the stakes were, within the internal logic of the bit, absolutely enormous. The expired coupon was treated as the gravest possible insult. Peter's response was proportionate to that reading of events. Ernie has been coming back ever since. In Season 4, Season 8, Season 10, Season 15. Each fight longer and more cinematic than the last, each one treating the original expired coupon as a grievance of world historical significance. The show gave a rooster a name and a wife and occasionally depicted his home life between fights. Ernie is one of the more complete secondary characters in the show, despite having no dialogue, no conventional character arc, and no narrative purpose beyond the specific physics of fighting Peter Griffin. On the subject of the Brian and Stewie friendship, which developed from their relationship as the two characters who could actually understand each other in the early seasons into the dominant emotional relationship of the show's middle and later periods, there is a quality to the friendship that is worth articulating clearly. It is the relationship between a character who represents the show's best aspirations and a character who represents its most original creative vision. And the fact that those two things became inseparable over time says something about what the show valued most when it was working well. Brian in the early seasons is who the show wanted to be. Smart, grounded, genuinely funny, emotionally honest. Stewie in the early seasons is what the show was at its most original. Genuinely strange, genuinely surprising, doing something no other animated character was doing in the same way. Their friendship, which deepened as both characters evolved, preserved something from each of them even as both of them changed. When they are in the scenes together and both characters are working as they should, the show is most fully itself. On the subject of Mayor Adam West, the real actor voicing an eccentric fictional version of himself, it is worth dwelling on the specific quality of what West brought to the role. He had been a television star in the 1960s, a legitimate pop culture icon, and by the time he appeared regularly on Family Guy starting in the early 2000s, his career had gone through the full arc of rediscovery that famous people from television's first era often experience. He had spent years being primarily known as the campy Batman, had done the convention circuit, had rebuilt his career through self-aware appearances that acknowledged his own place in entertainment history. What he brought to Mayor Adam West was a complete lack of defensiveness about any of it. He played the character as genuinely, profoundly oblivious in ways that required a performer who is comfortable with himself and his history. The West who played the mayor seemed to be having the most fun of anyone in the building, every time. On the subject of the show's music, which has been composed and arranged by Ron Jones and Walter Murphy across different periods of its production, there is a level of musical craft embedded in Family Guy that goes largely unnoticed by casual viewers, but that professional musicians and composers who have analyzed the show's scores consistently identify as significant. The show has original music cues, recurring musical themes for specific characters and situations, and a vocabulary of orchestral and jazz-influenced scoring that supports the comedy in ways that most animated shows do not attempt. The musical numbers in specific episodes, including the original songs written for episodes like I Dream of Jesus and similar musical comedy installments, are not throwaway parodies but genuine compositions produced with care. On the subject of the show's relationship to its own continuity, which is intentionally loose and sometimes deliberately contradictory, it is worth noting that this looseness is a feature rather than a bug. The show operates on a principle that most long-running animated sitcoms adopt. Continuity exists when it is useful and disappears when it is not. Peter can be established to have accomplished something in one episode and shown to have never done it in the next. Characters can die and return. Relationships can reset between installments. The show treats its own history as a toolkit rather than a record. This has frustrated some viewers and liberated others. The liberation comes from never being trapped by something that happened in Season 3. The frustration comes from never being sure that anything that happened in Season 14 actually matters. Section 6. The predictions. Eerily accurate moments. Facts. 61 through 75. What follows is not an argument that Family Guy possesses any form of genuine foresight or a supernatural relationship with the future. It is simply a record of what can happen statistically when a show spends over 25 years making jokes about every aspect of real life at significant volume, and when the writers happen to be paying closer attention to the world around them than most television rooms do. Fact 61. In the Season 5 episode Meet the Quagmires, Peter travels back to 1984 and inadvertently alters the future by changing the sequence of choices around who Lois ends up with. In the altered timeline, the episode depicts various things about the present-day world are different, and a television screen briefly shows content that appears to reference Caitlyn Jenner, then still publicly known as Bruce Jenner, in terms suggesting a transition that had not yet happened in public life. The episode aired in May 2007. Jenner publicly came out as a transgender woman in April 2015, 8 years after the episode was broadcast. MacFarlane's explanation for this kind of moment, offered consistently across multiple interviews, is that the writers were working from information circulating as rumor in Hollywood and entertainment circles, and that what looks like foresight often reflects information asymmetry between people who work inside the industry and people watching from outside it. Whether that fully accounts for the specificity of the reference or only partially addresses it is a question that does not have a clean answer. Fact 62. The Season 11 episode Turban Cowboy contained two separate joke elements that, in retrospect, made the episode impossible to continue airing after April 2013. One element was a cutaway in which Peter wins the Boston Marathon by driving a car through the crowd of runners. Dark physical comedy played as a quick visual gag. The other element, woven through the episode's main plot, involved Peter accidentally becoming associated with a terrorist network through a series of misunderstandings. The episode aired in March 2013. On April 15th of that year, two homemade bombs detonated near the Boston Marathon finish line, killing 3 people and wounding hundreds more. It was the worst terrorist attack on American soil since September 11th, 2001. Fox removed the episode from rotation following the attack. Neither joke element was a prediction. Together in the same episode, in the immediate context of what had actually happened at that specific race in that specific city, they formed a combination that could not be aired. The episode remained off the regular broadcast schedule for an extended period. Fact 63. Multiple early Family Guy episodes contained references to Kevin Spacey's behavior that, when examined in the context of the public allegations that emerged in October 2017, appeared less like comedy premises and more like the writers narrating information they had received. The references across several seasons suggested awareness of something specific, not simply general cynicism about celebrity. MacFarlane addressed this directly in a Newsweek interview in late 2017. He said the Spacey references were fact-checked before use. He said the writers were hearing the same rumors as everyone in Hollywood. Executive producer Richard Appel said at the same time that the writing staff had always had very open ears. MacFarlane was also asked publicly why, if he and the writers had reason to believe something was happening, they had joked about it rather than reported it. He said that having heard a rumor is not the same as having knowledge sufficient to report a crime. Not everyone found that a fully satisfying response. Fact 64. In a season 11 episode from 2013, Peter mentions Bitcoin offhandedly as a possible financial solution, while the family is discussing their money problems. At that point, Bitcoin was still largely unknown outside specific technical and financial communities, and had not yet become a mainstream cultural reference. In the months and years following the episode's broadcast, Bitcoin's price and public visibility rose dramatically and repeatedly, eventually becoming one of the more significant financial stories of the decade. The connection between the Family Guy mention and Bitcoin's trajectory is almost certainly statistical coincidence. The Bitcoin community's emotional relationship with the reference, however, is not coincidental at all. A number of enthusiasts have treated it as a kind of founding mythology, a moment when a mainstream show accidentally blessed what they were building. Fact 65. A cutaway gag from around season 9 depicted a fictionalized Ellen DeGeneres on a talk show, constantly interrupting her guests, talking over them, barely permitting them to reach the end of a thought before redirecting the conversation back to herself. At the time the gag aired, Ellen had a firmly established public reputation as one of the warmest, most approachable, and most relatable entertainers in American television. In 2020, detailed accounts from former employees of The Ellen DeGeneres Show described a workplace culture that contrasted sharply with that public image, including reports of management creating an environment of fear, staff being instructed not to speak directly to DeGeneres, and multiple incidents of behavior that former employees described as hostile. The cutaway, which had been a quick observational joke about celebrity behavior, was suddenly being shared widely online as an apparent early warning. Whether it was observation, rumor expressed obliquely, or coincidence is not fully established. Fact 66. A 2016 episode focusing on the anti-vaccination debate within the fictional community of Quahog depicted a measles outbreak spreading rapidly through the population after a significant portion of residents declined vaccination for their children. The episode was a satire of a debate that was already real in American public health at the time. The specific dynamics it depicted, the pattern of community resistance, the arguments being made on each side, The rate at which disease moved through an insufficiently vaccinated population and the downstream consequences of public health infrastructure failing to achieve herd immunity match the dynamics of real outbreaks and also matched in several specific ways the dynamics of the COVID-19 pandemic that began 4 years later. Rewatching the episode after 2020 produced in many viewers a specific and uncomfortable recognition that was not there on first viewing. Fact 67. In 2014, a Family Guy Viewer Mail 2 segment aired in the United Kingdom on BBC Three. The segment was called Fat Man and Robin and involved Peter being given the power to turn anyone he touched into a Robin Williams character, with the situation escalating until Peter considered ending his own life due to the burden of the ability. The segment broadcast in the UK on August the 12th, 2014. Robin Williams died by suicide later that same day. McFarlane has spoken publicly about the timing, always with care and with evident weight, and has made clear that the coincidence was genuine. Not a reference to anything known, not a premonition, simply a horrific alignment of a broadcast date with a real event. The episode was pulled from various rotation schedules in the days that followed. Fact 68. In a Season 4 episode from 2005, a brief reference to watching television content digitally or online was made in a context where that behavior was still relatively uncommon for mainstream audiences. The show was, without intending to, documenting a shift in how people consume media that would only become obvious several years later. Family Guy's catalog of cultural references functions, in aggregate, as a kind of timeline of what was normal in American life in each year. The show produced episodes, and occasionally those timelines jump ahead. Fact 69. The show's 2012 reference to Harvey Weinstein was, according to McFarlane, based on information available in Hollywood circles as rumor, and had been fact-checked before being worked into the script. McFarlane hosted the Academy Awards in February 2013 and made a joke during the ceremony that many people in retrospect read as a direct and knowing reference to Weinstein's behavior. When the full scope of that behavior became public in October 2017, McFarlane was widely cited as someone who had been gesturing toward it for years. He was also asked repeatedly why gesturing was the extent of his response. His answers described a distinction between knowing rumors and having evidence of crimes. The distinction is real. Whether it is sufficient is a matter people continue to disagree about. Fact 70. In a Season 11 episode where Peter becomes briefly immersed in the world of competitive motorcycling, a background detail visible in a crowd scene contains imagery connected to a specific real-world event that took place after the episode's production was completed. The detail has been identified by fans who go through episodes frame by frame, and has been discussed in online communities dedicated to finding this kind of material. Whether the connection is genuine or a product of the human tendency to find patterns in random material is genuinely ambiguous. Fact 71. The show depicted a quarantine scenario, characters confined indoors, unable to leave, growing irritable with each other and with the monotony. In a Season 15 episode that aired years before the COVID-19 pandemic, the specific dynamics of the confinement and the ways in which the characters responded to it emotionally and practically match the experience of early pandemic lockdowns closely enough that large numbers of viewers described the episode as uncannily familiar when they returned to it in 2020. Fact 72. Venezuela issued a formal government ban on Family Guy following the Season 7. Episode 420, in which Brian campaigns to legalize marijuana in Quahog. Venezuela's justice minister at the time formally cited the episode as an example of the United States using media to promote drug use. Cable stations in the country were warned they would face fines if they continued to air the show. Family Guy is one of the very few Western animated comedies to have generated a formal government broadcast prohibition in another country, And the Venezuelan ban remains one of the more surreal episodes in the show's long relationship with its own controversies. Fact 73. The season 13 episode called Turban Cowboy also contains, in the same runtime as the Boston Marathon reference, a sequence involving a cell phone that triggers an explosion. The sequence was pulled along with the rest of the episode following the April 2013 attack. Not because it was specifically predictive of any detail of that attack, but because the episode's overall atmosphere had become impossible to air in that context. The writers could not have anticipated the specific circumstances that would make the episode's content feel the way it did after the attack, which is itself a kind of dark illustration of why comedy about violence is always operating within a context it cannot control. Fact 74. MacFarlane gave an interview in April 2024 in which he discussed the show's continued existence and his own relationship to it. He said he did not see a reason to end the show while people still wanted to watch it, and described its continued production as having reached what he called escape velocity, a state where the show had been running long enough that there was no logical reason to stop unless the audience stopped caring. He framed the show's continuation in terms of its financial utility and its ability to fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. There was no mention of creative ambitions or stories he was eager to tell. The 2024 version of the conversation about why Family Guy keeps going sounds quite different from the 1998 version of the conversation about why it should exist at all. Fact 75. MacFarlane's consistent explanation for the show's moments of apparent prediction, that they are statistical outcomes of enormous creative volume rather than any form of genuine foresight, is both the most honest and the least satisfying explanation available. It is honest because it is almost certainly correct as a description of mechanism. It is unsatisfying because the moments themselves, when watched in sequence or encountered individually in the right context, do not feel like statistics. They feel like something was noticed. Whether noticing something and putting it in a cartoon is the same as knowing something is a question the show has never answered directly, and MacFarlane has been careful not to claim it either way. Section 6. B. More on the show's cultural footprint and hidden details. Beyond the individual facts already covered, there are aspects of Family Guy's production history and cultural impact that take more than a single sentence to do justice to, and several of them illuminate the show in ways that change how individual episodes feel on rewatch. The question of what the show actually is, what genre it occupies, and what it is trying to accomplish, is one that the writers themselves have engaged with, often obliquely through the show's self-referential moments. Family Guy is frequently described as a comedy of transgression, a show that operates by pushing past the limits of what other shows will attempt. But the more specific and accurate description might be that it is a show about the gap between how people present themselves and what they actually are. Peter Griffin presents himself as a father. What he actually is, in the show's most critical moments, is a man who has never been asked to be accountable for what he does. Brian presents himself as an intellectual. What he actually is in the show's most critical moments is a dog who wants to be taken seriously and has never done the work required to earn it. Stewie presented himself as a villain. What he actually was, it turned out, was a child performing an identity he had constructed to survive a family that had no idea what to do with him. The show is most interesting when it is exploring those gaps, and it is most interesting when the gap is most painful. On the subject of the show's treatment of Meg, which has been addressed in the character analysis sections, there is a production detail that does not get enough attention: the composition of the writer's room. For most of the show's run, the writing staff was predominantly male, and various accounts from the production suggest that the sustained cruelty toward Meg's character, which reached its peak intensity in the seasons from roughly season 4 through season 14, was both a product of that composition and a source of friction within it. The eventual reduction in Meg's abuse, which became noticeable from around season 15 onward, has been attributed in part to the addition of more women to the writing staff who pushed back against the pattern. By season 22, the extreme abuse had largely ceased, and Meg began receiving episodes in which she was competent, resilient, and occasionally genuinely impressive. The change in how Meg was treated on screen was connected to a change in who was in the room deciding how she would be treated. On the subject of the show's legacy among animated comedies, it is worth noting what Family Guy influenced rather than only what influenced it. The show's success with cutaway gags as a format contributed to a wave of animated comedies in the 2000s that adopted similar approaches. Quick transitions to unrelated material as a primary comedy tool. American Dad, which McFarlane co-created, deliberately chose not to use cutaway gags as a way of distinguishing itself, and that choice contributed to the creative differences between the two shows. Bob's Burgers, Archer, and various other animated comedies that launched in the years after Family Guy's revival all defined themselves in part by how they related to the Family Guy model, either by adopting aspects of it, rejecting specific elements of it, or finding a different formal solution to similar comedic problems. On the subject of the show's relationship to The Simpsons, which is its most obvious predecessor and most natural point of comparison, the two shows have always had a complicated public dynamic. Matt Groening has expressed opinions about Family Guy's writing at various points. The South Park episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006 and directly attacked Family Guy's joke structure as essentially random, received what McFarlane has described as multiple calls of gratitude from writers at both The Simpsons and King of the Hill. The Family Guy writers have responded to these criticisms across years of self-referential moments, sometimes defensively, sometimes with genuine humor about their own methods. The crossover episode The Simpsons Guy, which aired in 2014, managed to be simultaneously an act of tribute and a document of genuine creative tension. Two shows that respect each other's longevity while having fundamentally different ideas about what animated comedy is for. On the subject of the show's enormous DVD sales during its canceled period, it is worth understanding what those sales represented culturally. When the first and second season DVD sets sold over 400,000 copies in the period between cancellation and revival, they were doing so in a pre-streaming, pre-YouTube environment where owning a DVD was still the primary way to watch content outside of its original broadcast. People were buying physical objects, pressing them onto shelves in their homes, lending them to friends, rewatching specific episodes repeatedly in a way that the DVR culture of the mid-2000s was just beginning to enable for broadcast television. The audience that kept Family Guy alive between 2002 and 2005 was made of people who cared enough to pay money to own the show, which is a stronger indicator of attachment than a casual rerun viewer. That audience was real and passionate, and the show came back because of them. On the subject of the show's multiple attempts to make genuine emotional impact across its run, the pattern is consistent enough to be worth naming directly. The show knows how to make you feel something, and it frequently does, and it then consistently declines to carry that feeling forward. Brian and Stewie is genuinely affecting. The Meg episodes that try to give her real dignity are genuinely affecting. The Peter-sister reconciliation is genuinely affecting. The moments of real emotional honesty in the Brian and Stewie relationship across many episodes are genuinely affecting. The show has the capacity for emotional resonance and exercises it regularly. What it does not do is allow those moments to change anything. The reset button is always waiting. The next episode takes the characters back to where they were before the resonant moment happened. Whether this is a failure of ambition or a deliberate formal choice, a show about a family that does not change, choosing to represent that by literally not changing, is a question that different viewers answer differently. But it is worth sitting with, because it is one of the defining characteristics of what Family Guy is as a piece of storytelling. On the subject of the show's animation process, which sends scripts from the Los Angeles writers' room to animation studios in Korea before returning as finished episodes, the timeline from script to broadcast is considerably longer than most viewers appreciate. Episodes take months to produce after writing is completed. Jokes that appear in a finished episode were written during a period when the world looked different than it does when the episode airs. This is why the show occasionally appears to predict things. Some jokes are written months or even a year before broadcast, and in a fast-moving cultural environment, a joke about the near future can become a joke about the present by the time it reaches screens. The production timeline is one of the more mundane explanations for some of the show's more unsettling moments of apparent prescience. On the subject of the show's guest star history, which is extensive and includes a remarkable range of performers across its 25 plus seasons, the pattern of how guests are deployed tells you something about the show's ambitions at different points in its run. In the earlier seasons, guests were often used for a single strong joke or appearance. A celebrity who appeared because their specific persona or association was funny in a specific context. In later seasons, the guest star deployments became more elaborate, with extended appearances and more involved story integrations. The show has featured everyone from Gene Simmons to Rush Limbaugh to multiple former American presidents, depicted in ways that ranged from gentle to extremely pointed. The willingness to put specific real people in specific fictional situations, with varying levels of willingness from the people involved, is one of the show's most consistent sources of both its sharpest jokes and its most contested creative choices. The show's relationship with controversy is worth its own extended consideration. Family Guy has been the subject of formal complaints to the FCC, a government broadcast ban in Venezuela, protests from various religious and political groups, and periodic controversies over specific episodes or moments that drew criticism from communities who felt targeted or misrepresented. MacFarlane has generally addressed these controversies directly, sometimes defending specific choices, sometimes acknowledging that a particular line was crossed, and sometimes describing the show's intention in ways that suggested the provocative content was purposeful rather than careless. The show's provocations, at their best, serve the comedy. At their most criticized, they served something harder to defend: the idea that any subject was fair game regardless of whether the joke actually said anything worth saying about it. Section 7. The Star Wars episodes, crossovers, and hidden cameos. Facts: 76 through 90. The Blue Harvest Trilogy. Family Guy's three-part Star Wars parody spanning Blue Harvest, Something 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 Dark Side, and It's a Trap, represents one of the most ambitious creative projects the show undertook across its entire run. The episodes were produced with the actual cooperation of Lucasfilm, which granted limited rights for the parody use of the film's characters and mythology. And they are, for the devoted viewer, absolutely dense with material that requires multiple layers of knowledge to fully appreciate. Fact 76. The title Blue Harvest is not something the Family Guy writers invented for the occasion. It was the real, actual code name used during production of Star Wars Episode VI, Return of the Jedi, in 1983. The Lucasfilm production team had learned from the experience of filming earlier Star Wars movies that announcing filming locations publicly led to enormous disruptions from fans and press. So they constructed an elaborate fake production identity, complete with fake production offices, fake crew shirts bearing the tagline "Horror Beyond Imagination," fake paperwork describing an entirely different film. To conceal the fact that what was actually being made was the final chapter of the original trilogy, the cover held well enough to complete much of the principal photography without the kind of chaos that had plagued earlier productions. When Family Guy used Blue Harvest as its episode title in 2007, it was referencing a piece of Star Wars behind-the-scenes mythology that even committed fans sometimes do not know, wrapped in a pun about a horror film premise that never existed. Fact 77. The title of the second Star Wars special, Something 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 Dark Side, is a direct callback to a specific cutaway gag from the season 8 episode Barely Legal, which aired approximately 2 years before the special was produced. In that earlier episode, a very brief cutaway features Emperor Palpatine explaining to Darth Vader his theory of Star Wars dialogue. The theory is that whatever the specific content of any given line, the underlying structure is always the same. Something, 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 dark side. McFarlane used that throwaway background joke from 2 seasons prior as the title of an entire feature-length Star Wars special. Fully appreciating the title requires having seen and remembered a specific cutaway gag from one particular earlier episode, which itself aired during a season of the show that many people had already written off. It is a callback that rewards approximately the most dedicated possible viewer. Fact 78. The title of the third Star Wars special, It's a Trap, takes its name from one of the most quoted lines in the Star Wars franchise, Admiral Akbar's warning during the Battle of Endor in Return of the Jedi. The episode's opening text crawl, written in the tradition of the Star Wars opening titles that scroll through space, contains an acknowledgement that the production is aware this is the weakest of the 3 parodies, and that they are making it anyway because they felt obligated to complete the trilogy. The show announced its own quality deficit in the opening moments. It's a Trap is consistently rated lower than the other 2 specials in virtually every fan and critical ranking. The production knew. Fact 79. Carter Pewterschmidt plays Uncle Owen in Blue Harvest, and then appears as the Emperor in Something 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 Dark Side. Joe Swanson plays Biggs Darklighter in Blue Harvest, then a probe droid in the second special, then Jabba the Hutt in the third. Multiple other supporting characters undergo similar recasting across the 3 specials in ways that are consistent enough to seem deliberate. The show was acknowledging through the recasting pattern that its roster of recurring characters was being stretched across a mythology that requires far more distinct roles than Quahog normally provides. The same people are playing different parts in a different story, and the casting itself becomes a running acknowledgement of the show's limits. Fact 80. Meg's only appearance in Blue Harvest is as the tentacled garbage masher monster in the trash compactor scene aboard the Death Star. This is her sole contribution to the episode. In a later Star Wars special, Meg is given a brief moment to object to her consistently marginal role in the parodies, and Peter dismisses her in his standard fashion. The arc of her involvement across the 3 specials, beginning as a garbage creature eventually complaining about it being dismissed, is a compressed version of how her character has been handled throughout the broader show. The writer staged a mini version of the full Meg narrative inside the Star Wars trilogy and gave it approximately 90 seconds of total screen time. Fact 81. In the Blue Harvest cantina scene, which contains Roger from American Dad, Coach McGurk from Home Movies, Bender from Futurama, and the Evil Monkey, there is also the character Fawad. Fawad is a recurring minor character in Family Guy itself, the one who, in an earlier episode, attempted to teach Peter about cross-cultural humor and the limits of sarcasm as a universal communication tool. Having Fawad stationed as an Imperial officer in the Death Star's prison level, far from his familiar cultural context, is either a random background casting decision or a deliberate callback to a character defined by being out of place in conversations about communication. Given the level of intentionality visible everywhere else in that episode, a deliberate choice seems likely. Fact 82. When Roger from American Dad appears in the Simpsons Guy crossover episode in Season 13, he arrives briefly and departs quickly. The episode acknowledges through the speed and manner of his departure that American Dad had moved from Fox to TBS by that point and was no longer part of the same broadcast universe as Family Guy and The Simpsons. A corporate network transition, the kind of business decision that happens in boardrooms and affects schedules and ad rates, was communicated through an alien's quick cameo in an animated crossover. It is one of the more oblique ways in which the show has processed its own institutional history. Fact 83. The fight between Peter and Homer Simpson in The Simpsons Guy mirrors the structural choreography of Peter's recurring fights with Ernie the Giant Chicken. In its escalating pace, its deliberate destruction of the surrounding environment, and its sense of two figures with enormous personal stakes locked in something that has become much larger than its origin. Homer uses Emmy Awards as physical weapons during the fight. Peter has none to use in return. The specific choice of awards as weapons, and the specific asymmetry of who has them and who does not, encodes a commentary on the two shows' respective relationships with the Television Academy into the fight choreography. The comment is being made through physical action rather than dialogue, and it lands in both directions. Fact 84. The opening text crawl of Blue Harvest contains a specific and pointed reference to Fox's decision to permit George Lucas to retain the Star Wars merchandising rights during the original 1977 distribution negotiations. This is historical fact. Lucas accepted a lower directing fee for the original film in exchange for keeping those rights. Fox agreed. The result was that Fox distributed what became one of the most commercially successful film franchises in history and received none of the revenue from the action figures, the lunchboxes, the Halloween costumes, the video games, the clothing, the theme park attractions, and the thousands of other Star Wars products that generated, by various estimates, billions of dollars over the following decades. Family Guy treated this as a punchline at Fox's expense. The punchline is also a business school case study that is still being discussed in entertainment industry negotiations courses. Fact 85. Bender from Futurama appears in the Blue Harvest Cantina. Futurama was created by Matt Groening and premiered on Fox in 1999, the same year Family Guy launched. The two shows shared a network, a cultural moment, and a certain sensibility about science fiction comedy during their overlapping periods on the air. Both shows were canceled and revived. Both found substantial audiences through reruns and later through streaming. Bender's presence in the cantina is an act of cross-show recognition, a gesture from one group of writers to another that they are aware of each other and appreciate the work being done across the hall, or at least across the network's programming schedule. Fact 86. Coach McGuirk from the Cartoon Network series Home Movies is the most obscure of the Blue Harvest Cantina crossover characters. Home Movies ran from 1999 to 2004 and was created by Brendan Small and Lauren Bouchard. Small later created Metalocalypse and Death Clock. Bouchard later created Bob's Burgers, which became one of the most consistently praised animated comedies of the 2000s. McGurk's presence in a bar in a galaxy far away is a gesture of affection from the Family Guy team toward a show that had no network connection to Fox, no overlap in audience demographics, and no particular commercial relationship with the Family Guy production. The cameo connects shows across network lines through shared sensibility and mutual respect. Fact 87. The Road to the Multiverse episode, in which Brian and Stewie travel through parallel universes and visit different versions of the Family Guy reality, required the production to fully replicate multiple distinct animation styles within a single episode. One universe is drawn in the style of Japanese anime, with the specific visual grammar and character design conventions of that tradition. One is drawn in the style of a Disney animated musical, complete with original songs and the particular compositional choices associated with Disney animation. One universe is depicted in live action, with real actors standing in for the animated characters. Each alternate reality required a complete visual language change, executed with sufficient fidelity to function as genuine tribute to the tradition being parodied. The episode is one of the more technically ambitious things the show produced across its full run. Fact 88. The Season 7 Episode 3 Kings adapts 3 separate Stephen King works, Stand By Me, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption, in a single 22-minute episode. The casting of each character in each adaptation was deliberate. The choice to cast Stewie as Annie Wilkes in the Misery segment is the most precise. Annie Wilkes is defined by a consuming devotion that transitions without apparent transition into sudden, extreme violence. She loves the writer Paul Sheldon so intensely that she is willing to imprison and maim him to keep him producing the work she wants. This is a fairly accurate description of Stewie's own relationship with the objects of his attachment, at least during the period of the show when the character was at his most genuinely unhinged. The parody illuminated something true about both characters simultaneously and did so entirely through casting. Fact 89. Blue Harvest production was undertaken with the actual cooperation of Lucasfilm. The studio granted limited rights for the parody use of specific Star Wars imagery, music, and character designs. This cooperation is documented and was noted in press coverage of the episode at the time of its production. The episode is therefore not, strictly speaking, a parody in the legal sense that permits use without permission. It is an authorized creative exercise, which means its extensive Star Wars fidelity was possible precisely because the people who own Star Wars decided that the Family Guy team could be trusted with it. Fact 90. Something, something, something. Darkside's text crawl takes a specific swing at 20th Century Fox for permitting George Lucas to retain the Star Wars merchandising rights and frames this as one of the most costly negotiating failures in modern entertainment. This is a particularly pointed joke given that Family Guy airs on Fox, is produced under a Fox deal, and is essentially being broadcast by the entity it is mocking inside the text crawl of one of its own episodes. The show has always been most comfortable pointing its sharpest jokes at the institution, funding its existence. And the text crawl of its own Star Wars special is probably its most prominent use of that particular venue. Section 8. Deep Cuts. The things almost nobody knows. Facts. 91 through 101. These last 11 are the ones that live in the quieter corners of the show's history. Some of them are production details. Some of them are character revelations. Some of them are simply strange enough to stay with you long after everything else from this video has faded. Fact 91. Herbert the Pervert. The elderly neighbor whose fixation on Chris Griffin has been one of the show's most sustained and uncomfortable running elements, was created and voiced by Mike Henry, the same person who originally voiced Cleveland Brown and who also voices Bruce, the greased-up deaf guy, and Consuela. Henry built Herbert with a slow, breathy delivery that turned genuine discomfort into something absurd, without ever fully neutralizing the unease underneath it. The character was eventually given a wartime backstory revealing that he served as a soldier during World War II, with some distinction. Herbert the Pervert is canonically a veteran. He earned medals during his service. He is also the most consistently unsettling presence in the show's recurring cast, and the show has maintained both of these facts about him simultaneously without apparent difficulty. Fact 92. The greased-up deaf guy has never been given a name or a backstory in the show's official canon. He appears in various episodes, usually without setup or explanation. He runs. He cannot be caught by any character who attempts to apprehend him. He exists in a state of perpetual, frictionless, unstoppable motion. He has been a recurring presence in Quahog across many seasons without ever being given an origin, a motivation, a family, or a purpose beyond the gag itself. Some characters exist entirely within their own inexplicable premise, and he is the purest example the show has produced. Fact 93. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie contains no cutaway gags. This bears repeating with emphasis, not one. The entire 22-minute episode takes place in a single location. A bank vault where the two characters have been accidentally locked overnight after a visit goes wrong, and consists entirely of them talking to each other in real time. No jumping to other locations. No random visual jokes. No transitions to unrelated scenes. Brian, in the course of the night, tells Stewie that he keeps a loaded gun in his safety deposit box, and that there have been periods of genuine despair in his life, during which he has sat with the idea of using it on himself. He tells this to a baby in a diaper who responds with more emotional intelligence than most adults the show has ever depicted. Stewie tells Brian without deflection that he would be devastated if Brian were gone, that he would not want to go on in a world that did not contain him. The episode was produced as a deliberate departure from the show's standard format, and it is consistently and widely identified as among the best 22 minutes the show ever made. It remains proof that the characters and the voice performances were always capable of sustaining something that asked more of them than a set-up punchline cycle ever could. Fact 94. Back to the pilot, the season 10 episode in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to observe the first episode of Family Guy, contains a background moment that is the show making a specific and self-aware joke about its own most criticized structural habit. During a cutaway gag from the original pilot, the Griffin family is shown in the background of the scene simply standing in the living room doing nothing, waiting for the unrelated sequence to finish so the story can resume. They have nowhere to go. They have nothing to do. From their perspective, a cutaway is a pause in their own existence while something that has nothing to do with them plays out around them. This is an accurate description of what a cutaway gag does to the narrative structure of an episode, and the show placed it quietly in the background of a time travel episode about its own origins, as a joke dressed as a moment of honesty dressed as a joke. Fact 95. Vinny, the dog who briefly replaced Brian following his death in the season 12 episode Life of Brian, was voiced by Tony Sirico. Best known as Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos, Sirico brought Vinny a warm, New York Italian energy that was deliberately distinct from Brian in almost every respect. Warmer in affect, more immediately affectionate, less invested in appearing intellectual. Vinny was received reasonably well during the 2 episodes he occupied before Brian's death was reversed through time travel, and the status quo was restored. He now exists in a kind of canonical limbo, having been fully established as a character, then quietly removed when Brian returned, with no in-universe explanation provided for where he went. He is simply not there anymore, and the show has never acknowledged this. Fact 96. Seth MacFarlane signed a reported $200 million multi-year deal with NBC Universal in 2020, moving his production company Fuzzy Door Productions into the Comcast family of networks. This move made the Orville and subsequent MacFarlane productions Comcast and NBC Universal properties rather than Fox ones. Family Guy remained at Fox under pre-existing contractual commitments. The result was that MacFarlane was simultaneously building his creative future at a different network while continuing to voice Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire for the show that remained on the network he had publicly described, in 2021, in terms of a failing marriage. He compared his situation to that of someone who knows a relationship is not working, but has not yet managed to leave. He said this in public about the network that was broadcasting his show while the show continued to air. Fact 97. Peter Griffin's biological father is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish heavy drinker with a complete lack of accountability for his choices, who was introduced in a season 5 episode that revealed Peter was adopted. Peter's adoptive father, Francis Griffin, was a strict and occasionally cruel Catholic man whose rigid religious expectations shaped Peter's entire childhood and contributed to his complicated relationship with authority and self-worth. The show established through these 2 characters that Peter has 2 fathers, one who gave him his genetics and one who gave him his religion, and that both of them contributed something broken and unresolved to the person he became. This information sits quietly in the background of the show's entire character history and has never been fully reckoned with in a sustained narrative way. Fact 98. Chris Griffin's full legal name, Chris Cross Griffin, with Cross as the middle name Peter chose as a Catholic tribute, sits in the show's canon as one of its quietest sustained jokes. The fact itself is delivered without ceremony and received without comment by any character in the show. The joke does not announce itself. It simply exists in the record, waiting for the viewer who pauses and thinks, wait. Peter named his son after a 1990s hip hop duo whose biggest hit was Jump by accident through sincere devotion to a religion that asked him to honor the cross. The comedy requires the viewer to assemble it. Nobody in Quahog has ever noticed. Fact 99. The season 14 episode Peter's Sister provides a genuine, carefully constructed psychological explanation for Peter's treatment of Meg. The episode reveals that Peter was physically and emotionally abused throughout his childhood by his own sister, and that this unresolved cycle of abuse has unconsciously shaped how he relates to his daughter. The episode handles this material with surprising care. Both Peter and Meg arrive at genuine emotional honesty with each other. Peter acknowledges what he has done. Meg shows compassion and understanding for the person who has been most consistently cruel to her. It is a real moment between two characters who have rarely been given real moments together. The episode that follows returns immediately to Peter treating Meg exactly as he treated her before. The reconciliation happened. It changed nothing. The show understood its own psychology precisely enough to explain it, and then continued the psychology anyway, which is a specific kind of storytelling choice that says something about what the show believes about people. That knowing where your damage comes from does not automatically free you from repeating it. Fact 100. In the episode You Can't Handle the Booth, structured as a DVD commentary track for an earlier episode with the full principal cast providing commentary and character, Peter mentions that the real-world version of the Griffin House is located in Burbank, California. He also mentions that fans keep stealing the mailbox from whatever address they have identified as the real-world counterpart to 31 Spooner Street. The episode uses the commentary format to do something that no regular episode structure permits. To have the characters acknowledge that they are characters, recorded in a booth, assembled by animators, broadcast by a network, that their house exists somewhere in California, and that real people have been stealing mailboxes from it. The fictional world and the production reality occupy the same frame, and neither one fully disappears into the other. Fact 101. In the very first episode of Family Guy, Death Has a Shadow, broadcast on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, seen by approximately 22 million people on that first night, there were cutaway gags. From the very first minute of the very first episode, the structural format that would define the show was already present and operational. MacFarlane and his original writing team did not introduce the cutaway gradually. They did not test it first or use it sparingly to establish the show's tone before committing. It was there from the beginning, built into the show's fundamental design before anyone knew whether it would work, before the show had an audience, before it had a history. The cutaway gag was the tool MacFarlane chose to build with, and he chose it on the first episode of the first season. Everything that followed, the celebrated gags and the celebrated complaints about the celebrated gags, the decades of brilliant moments and the decades of structural criticism, the show's entire complicated relationship with its own most famous feature, all of it was present in embryo on the night of the Super Bowl in January 1999, in a format that nobody had quite tried before and that would eventually be talked about by both fans and critics more than almost anything else about the show. It was always there. The whole shape of the thing was already in the room. Section 8. Sapaisomain. B. The show's place in history and what it left behind. Family Guy's cultural legacy is genuinely complicated to assess, and that complication is part of what makes it interesting to think about. It is not a show that went from greatness to mediocrity in a clean arc that critics can point to and explain. It is a show that was genuinely great, genuinely significant, genuinely influential, and then made specific choices, identifiable, traceable choices that changed what it was. Those choices were made by real people in a real room, and the show continued after them, carrying the weight of what it had been while becoming something different. The show's most lasting contribution to animated comedy is probably the cutaway gag format itself, which it did not invent. You can find structural antecedents in shows going back decades, but which it popularized and made definitional in a way that changed how subsequent shows thought about the relationship between comedy and narrative. After Family Guy, the question of whether a joke needs to serve the story it is interrupting became a meaningful, formal debate in animated comedy. Bob's Burgers chose to answer the question one way. Archer chose another. Rick and Morty, which arrived later and built on many things Family Guy established, found its own answer. All of these shows exist in a conversation that Family Guy started, even if they arrived at different conclusions. The show's second lasting contribution is Stewie Griffin as originally conceived. The evil genius baby, the one-year-old Bond villain in a diaper, planning world domination between feedings. Stewie in the first 3 seasons was genuinely unlike anything that had appeared in animated comedy before. The character was built on a specific formal paradox, the gap between what a baby looks like and what this particular baby was saying, and that paradox was exploited with consistent creative intelligence across those early seasons. Every scene with Stewie carried a charge of unpredictability, a sense that anything could happen next because the character operated by rules that had no precedent. You could not predict Stewie by reference to other characters you had seen, because there were no other characters like him. The creative decision to retire that version of the character and replace him with something more emotionally grounded and more conventionally funny is one of the show's most significant choices, and it is still contested among the people who loved the original version most. The show's third lasting contribution might be its sustained engagement with self-reference, the meta-textual layer that runs through its whole history, and that became more prominent as the seasons accumulated. Family Guy has always known what it is. It has always acknowledged, in ways ranging from subtle to explicit, that it is a television show being produced by real people in a building in California. That its characters are animated constructs made by writers and voice actors, that its relationship to reality is mediated and artificial. Most shows try to maintain the illusion of their own reality. Family Guy periodically pulls back the curtain and shows you the stage machinery, and then the curtain goes back up and the show continues as though nothing happened. This creates a specific viewing experience. You are never entirely inside the fiction because the show keeps reminding you that it is fiction, and that experience is either alienating or liberating, depending on what you want from the shows you watch. The show's impact on its voice cast is worth considering on its own terms. Seth MacFarlane spent roughly 25 years voicing 4 primary characters in the same show, while simultaneously building a film and television career that encompassed the Ted franchise, The Orville, multiple music albums in the big band and jazz standards tradition, and a significant presence as a public figure with stated political views and professional opinions about the industry. Alex Borstein went from voice actress to Emmy-winning dramatic actress, winning multiple Emmy Awards for her performance in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Seth Green has maintained a parallel career in live-action film and television throughout his time on the show. Mila Kunis became one of the most prominent film actresses of her generation while continuing to voice Meg. The cast of Family Guy is, by any measure, a remarkable collection of talented people, and the show's continued existence has required all of them to balance their ongoing commitment to it with careers that have grown in ways nobody could have predicted when they first recorded their lines in 1998. On the subject of the show's renewal through season 27, announced in early 2025, the transaction says something specific about the entertainment industry's relationship to content that has demonstrated consistent commercial performance. Family Guy is cheap to produce relative to live-action programming. It has enormous residual value on streaming platforms. it generates merchandise revenue across multiple global markets. None of these things require the show to be creatively vital. The business case for continuing it exists independently of the creative case. And in the current entertainment environment, the business case is the one that matters to the people making the decisions. This is not unique to Family Guy. It describes the economics of most long-running franchise properties across most entertainment formats. But it is worth naming clearly because it is part of what the show is now. A valuable intellectual property that continues to be produced because it remains profitable, and that happens to still be capable of genuinely funny and occasionally genuinely moving television, even if it is capable of those things less consistently than it was when it began. The apartment where Seth MacFarlane lived when he was working on the original Family Guy pilot, the modest California apartment of a 24-year-old who had recently moved from the East Coast and was spending 6 months in an almost entirely solo creative effort, is not a historical landmark. Nobody has put a plaque outside it. The security guard at the Rhode Island School of Design, whose voice became Peter Griffin, has presumably retired without ever knowing what happened to the voice MacFarlane borrowed from him. The dorm room door with the leopard print is long gone from whatever wall it hung on. The thesis film sits in archives available to those who look for it, showing a middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog Steve going on modest misadventures that are clearly the earliest draft of something much larger. All of these things contributed to a show that 22 million people watched on a January Sunday in 1999, that went away and came back twice, that got canceled and revived and renewed, and moved to Wednesday nights, that was nominated for an Emmy that The Simpsons never received, that predicted things it should not have been able to predict, that built a cantina scene full of cameos from 3 different animated universes, that hid a message in a Tron wall that requires you to rotate your television to read, that named a baby Megatron and a nerd after a real writer who went on to greater things, that had its creator miss a plane by 10 minutes on the worst morning in recent American history, and that is, as of the recording of this script, still on the air and still producing new episodes and still occasionally doing something that makes you stop whatever you are doing and pay close attention. That is what 101 facts add up to. Not a complete picture, no 101 facts could produce that, but a portrait with enough detail to feel like something real. Section 9. The Last Thought. 101 facts. A few large enough to genuinely reshape how you think about the show. Many small enough to live in a single detail. A newspaper headline you can only read if you stop the episode. A license plate on a passing car. A block arrangement on a living room floor that spells something terrible and specific about the baby sitting next to it. All of them real. All of them placed there deliberately or arrived at through the specific collision of talent and history and coincidence that produced this show and kept producing it for longer than most animated comedies stay alive. There is a particular pleasure in knowing this much about something you have spent time with casually. When you have watched a show as background comfort, the kind of thing you return to because you know it, because it is familiar, because the voices and the rhythms of it feel settled and known, and then you discover that the backgrounds you have been half watching contain messages, that the newspapers contain jokes directed at you specifically, that the voices came from real people in real moments of reading or listening, or accidentally overhearing something funny in a corridor. The thing you thought you knew entirely becomes something you have only been looking at from one angle. The depth was always there. You just had not yet found the right way to look. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when Fox handed him a television series based on a thesis film he made in art school. He spent 6 months producing the pilot largely by himself on a budget of $50,000, built 4 of the 6 main character voices from scratch, designed the world, wrote the scripts, and submitted the result to a network that broadcast it after the most-watched sporting event in American television to an audience of 22 million people. That is a staggering set of circumstances to have been the beginning of something. Most things do not begin that cleanly or that luckily, or with that perfect alignment of one person's ability and one moment's opportunity. The show that came out of that beginning has been complicated, uneven, sometimes brilliant, and sometimes disappointing, and sometimes something in between. It has made extraordinary creative decisions, and it has made choices that were harder to defend. It has produced the best animated television of the early 2000s, and it has, in different seasons, produced some of the most critically contested. It has carried the weight of everything it was in its best years into every subsequent year, which is both a gift and a burden, because viewers who loved the early show have always been watching the later show against that memory. But the secrets are still in there. The red rum in the blocks. The headline that describes the exact behavior required to find it. The John Williams nomination on a fake adult film ballot. The cantina full of crossover figures from 3 different animated universes, visible for seconds, in the background of a Star Wars parody. The voice of Peter Griffin belonging to a security guard who walked the corridors of an art school and never knew. The voice of Brian requiring no performance at all. Just one man speaking as himself, wearing a dog like a second skin. The thesis film at art school with the wife named Lois and the talking dog named Steve, existing now in archives where anyone can find it, showing the whole thing waiting to be built. There is something that feels right about encountering all of this in a quiet hour. The show was always made by people who cared about the people who cared enough to look closely. This is looking closely. This is the version of watching Family Guy where you are not only watching the surface of it, but the whole structure underneath. The choices and the coincidences and the hidden rooms that have been there since the first episode, waiting for whoever slows down enough to find them. Thank you for spending this time here. If this settled you tonight, and if it was something good to have on while the world got quiet, then it did exactly what it was built to do. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you have not already. It matters more than you might expect, and it costs you nothing at all. Sleep well. Whatever else there is can wait until morning. The show will still be there. The Easter eggs will still be in the background. The blocks will still spell Redrum. The cantina will still be full. The security guard in Providence who did not know his voice would travel this far will not know even now, but he contributed to something that millions of people have carried around in their memories for a very long time. And that is a strange and quiet kind of legacy. Good night. On the subject of the show's most memorable one-off experiments, it is worth noting that Brian and Stewie was not an isolated creative accident. It was the product of a deliberate decision by the writing staff to attempt something they had not tried before and might not try again. The episode exists as proof of what the show could be when it gave itself permission to be something different. Its existence alongside hundreds of episodes built on the standard format is, in its own way, one of the show's most interesting creative facts. That the formula and the departure from the formula were both made by the same people, in the same writer's room, for the same show, and that the departure was at least as good as the formula at its best. A note on what this show built. There is one final thing worth saying before this ends. Family Guy premiered in a year when animated television was still largely understood as either children's entertainment or as a genre represented by The Simpsons and South Park. What McFarlane built was something that did not fit either category cleanly. A show for adults that was not interested in social commentary the way South Park was, and not interested in warmth and craft the way The Simpsons was at its peak, but was instead interested in something harder to categorize. Volume, density, the experience of watching a show that was moving so fast and in so many directions simultaneously that you could not quite catch everything it was doing. That experience, the sense that there was always something you had missed, something in the background, something under the surface, was not accidental. It was the design. It was Seth MacFarlane, at 24, building the kind of show he would have wanted to find at that age. A show with a reward for every level of attention you chose to bring to it. A show that gave you the jokes on the surface and then gave you different jokes underneath, for however deep you wanted to go. That promise has not always been kept equally across every season of the show's long run. Some seasons kept it more faithfully than others, but the promise was there from the first episode, and the fact that people are still going back and finding things in the backgrounds of those early episodes, still pausing on newspaper headlines, still reading the blocks, still identifying cameos in the cantina, suggests that what McFarlane built in those early years was more durable than even he may have anticipated. 101 Facts, a show that started with a security guard's voice and a thesis film, and a professor who sent a tape. Everything else followed from there. These are not footnotes to a show. They are the show. Every hidden detail is a choice someone made. Every Easter egg is a joke waiting for the right person at the right moment. Every fact in this video belongs to something that started with a thesis film and a missed alarm and a security guard who talked loudly in the right corridor at the right time. That is what 101 Facts are really about. Not the show's continuity or its trivia record, the specific human beings who built it, and the specific strange sequence of events that gave them the chance. Sleep well. Good night.